This episode of the podcast is brought to you by LeafWell. Hello, listeners of Cannabinoid Connect. Have you ever thought about getting a medical cannabis card? The process can be intimidating and difficult to navigate, to say the least. That's why I've partnered with LeafWell, the easiest and most affordable way to get a medical card in Texas and in 32 other states in the US. LeafWell seamlessly connects you to a network of doctors that will help you get certified online in minutes. LeafWell is run by data scientists, cannabis specialists, and patient advocates that are passionate about increasing access and education around medical cannabis use. LeafWell's patient support team is also there to support you throughout your entire journey using medical cannabis. As I mentioned, I've partnered with LeafWell to provide all my listeners with a discount to become certified for medical cannabis. Simply go to their website at leafwell.com and use the promo code CCTX to receive $15 off the price of getting a medical card. Again, that's leafwell.com. Use the promo code CCTX to receive $15 off the price of getting a medical cannabis card. LeafWell only charges if you get approved. So what do you have to lose? Visit leafwell.com today. Use the promo code CCTX to get certified for medical cannabis, risk-free. Lulu Tsui, how are you?
Hey Kevin, it's getting cold out here in New York, but my spirit is very high and excited. Just a little bit physically tired because I flew in from Emerald Cup last night, so didn't get
Oh,
too much sleep.
man, going from one extreme to the other in terms of weather too, right? I mean, the Emerald Cup, I'm sure the weather out there in California is still sunshine and rainbows for the most part, and then going back to New York is a little different, or
It was pretty, it was pretty cold this weekend. I mean, Saturday was pretty, tolerable. It got a little bit windy and cold, and actually, I think it snowed up there too. I saw some snow caps in the hills on my way out.
oh wow, okay. So yeah, there it's cooling off. Seems to be everywhere. Even in Texas, it's been rainy and just kind of miserable. There's been tornado storms. Like we had a tornado warning this morning. Uh,
Whoa, the
I
weather is
know.
broken. The weather is officially broken.
I would agree with that for sure. Well, how was the Emerald Cup? Tell me a little bit about that.
It was cool. I mean, it's always a good time. The true heads are there. It's like the genetics, the clones, it's like I think a very OG California experience, and like the true believers go to Emerald Cup.
Yeah, it seems like it. Like when you say the OGs, I'm thinking like the legacy heads, like the people that have been in it for the longest of times. And really know when you talk about strains like genetics and know different ways of growing and just basically evolving the way in which this plant is consumed, right?
100%. I mean, the Node Labs, Compound Genetics, Purple City Genetics, like, you know, uh, I think Finest. There's just like a lot of interesting things happening as well in terms of like the different crosses, and like genetics are almost like the hot new sneaker these days. So it was great to see some of the technology that's happening with those guys, the legacy cultivators, the second, third generation cultivators from the Emerald Triangle, just the fans of cannabis in general. It's really great to just have experience, and to be there to experience kind of the true essence of cannabis culture, from like the cultivation and from the love of it, as opposed to more of like the business conferences, where I call it like the science bros and the finance bros are. So it's always nice to go to Emerald Cup. I really have a good time there.
Yeah, it seems like it's super differentiated in that way because it's more immersive and more about the culture as opposed to, like you said, the networking of like some of the business conferences or trade shows that you go to, you know. When you speak about like technology, what were some of, I mean, and of course we want to get into that, especially your background of 15 plus years leading research and strategy, particularly in the experience design and user experience design space. But what trends did you see coming out of the Emerald Cup? I mean, maybe in terms of technology, I mean, talking more of like devices and innovation in that front. And of course, we can get into
Ooh,
some of the SaaS and
I
B2B
didn't.
technology later.
Yeah, I kind of was kind of bad this way. I just went to go hang out and see friends because it was, past COVID. Hadn't really seen a lot of people. So it was really great to connect. So sat through a lot of the panels. The psychedelic panels are really interesting. Reggie Harris and Oakland Hyphae. I'm actually an advisor to that group. So it was really great to see the interest that was happening around psychedelics and like, trying to maybe not repeat some of the same legislative and regulatory mistakes, I could say,
Mm-hmm.
that happened with legal cannabis. Again, I was going to say like the genetics part of it has just been really interesting to see. Just, and I'm not an expert, but learning how like to propagate it and how like it is in tissue culture and then releasing it into the world. And so, my friends, Felipe and Lauren at Compound and Genetics and Node Labs are just like amazing human beings, and just learning about how they're trying to create an ecosystem where people are able to get paid royalties and for the things that they contribute into the ecosystem. So it was really great. Like I feel like Cannabis 1.0 was very much about like me, and what can I do and squash the competition. I don't think it's worked. I think California is kind of experiencing the effects of that kind of attitude. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's very much about trying to build together, trying to create an actual ecosystem where everyone can right now survive, but eventually thrive.
Well, I definitely want to get into like the tech and business side of kind of your role and the impact that you're making within the industries, particularly in the in the East Coast within the New York market. But let's talk about what you just said. Like, how do we move forward as an industry in terms of really communicating the efficacy and the endless applications of this plant?
I think creating the correct partnerships with people that share a similar ethos. I think when Cannabis 1.0, legal Cannabis 1.0 started, there was kind of like this rush to be number one. There was like all this money floating around. It was like spend, 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 be big, be big. And at the end of the day, it's like I've known so many companies have gone out of business that took deals with, kind of shady operators that, at the end of the day, the only people that made money were the lawyers, right? People
Right.
running away with money, people like taking this, like it just never really was kind of the authentic way that even legacy ran, right? Like, and I say this because I was raised by cultivation legacy in Oregon, and it was still a network of people that you trusted, right, most
Right.
likely. Like
Right.
and then when you kind of went out, there was a code, and when you went out of your network, like you take these risks and things
You
happen.
knew that
That's
something had happened, right? That was something you managed in terms of expectations. Yeah,
right.
I get
So I
that.
think one thing that I've noticed is like, do people sometimes get so excited about cannabis they don't do their due diligence. I got really excited with my first software thing that I was trying to do, and I was very much impressed by somebody's resume and their title and who they were, and it just turned out like we're in a place in our industry where you have to have people that want to do the work. Sometimes people from management or C-suite come in, and in other industries they have support. They've got teams that can build X, Y, and Z for them. And right now with cannabis, like you have to do everything. You have to like really want to be part of this. You have to You can't sit idly by and, run things from your computer, from your desk. It's kind of like roll up your sleeves, get in there, be an example. Highest, it's going to be the highest of the highs and lowest of the lows. And it's really going to be important to surround yourself with people that during times of scarcity are going to be graceful in how they act.
Right.
So
Right.
so I'd say more than anything, find good partners, find, know your partners, know how they are as actors, and, people show who they are, believe in that, and don't trick yourself into thinking that you're going to be the exception.
Yeah. I mean, that's such great advice. One, because in entrepreneurship 101, it's like human capital is the most important thing. You got to surround yourself with the right people, like you said, especially if you're bootstrapping and you need people to be reliable, and you need to count on them to get the job done and get it done, you know, in a good way, right? Or in a productive way. And so adding on to that is the fact that right now the industry is so new that it's more important than ever, because we can weed out the bad actors, because there is this microscope. The community is fairly small, right, as an
Mhm.
industry. I
It
mean,
is.
people kind of know each other. They're going to the same trade shows and business conferences like we talked about earlier. So I think that's really, really sound advice. How have you applied some of the things that you've learned, particularly within the technology space? I know that you've had clients that you've built apps for like, the names of Bloomberg, MasterCard, and others. What have you applied in that prior experience into cannabis, and how has that worked for you?
So I would say, so my field of user experience design or experience design, the name has been changing, is really about learning the motivations and the behaviors of who you're designing for, right? So the end user or the attendee or X, Y, and Z, even sometimes the end user is the bot, right? So really trying to understand like what is the purpose? What are they trying to do? Like, and creating tools to help support their jobs. So I always call myself a lazy designer. Like I feel like it's important that you have tools to get your job done quickly, easily. So then you have time to do the things that you really want to do, whether it's spend time with your family or, go hang out with friends or have a hobby. So I just feel like it's really unfortunate that a lot of times when software is being made, the normal, I'm going to get a little bit geeky, but the
No,
normal
that's fine.
phase
Yeah.
of things is first you have engineers designing something and they're building it. So they're building the framework, they're making sure that things kind of work, but there's no like human touch part to it. It's all the functional things, it's all the logistical things. It's like testing the database links, like making sure the pages load, but it's not really intuitive, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they've created this framework of, let's use the house analogy. They've created this framework where the house is is there, but we haven't added like, oh, how should the rooms flow into each other, or what types of sinks are we going to use, are there handicap people that are going to need access to this house, older people, like, so I just think that a lot of times when I approach anything in cannabis, whether it's our events from On The Revel or a delivery platform, it's really targeting and understanding like who are we designing this for, right?
Mm-hmm.
How can we make their life easier? Like what are the expectations that they have when they're using this? So um and like you can apply that with that understanding to anything that you design or you want to release out into the world.
Yeah, it's been such a really important job role, especially, with the emergence of apps on your phone and all that. I mean, user experience, like, that's a must. And if someone has a bad experience, say on a website or an app, they leave, right? And it's hard to get that person to come back. You really have one chance. I love the way you put it earlier. Like, I want to, and I'm going to basically paraphrase and say you want to automate things for clients within the industry so that they can focus on more important things, like you said, like family, personal, or even other business
Yeah.
operations. what examples of projects? I mean, is it focused on the operational side? Is it on the retail? I mean, is it within your capacity and on the Revel? Like, what has been your experience? What are some of the projects you can talk about?
So for On the Revel, we're in the event space. So for example, we are, what we always do is to make sure that we have programming that's relevant. So what I mean by that is, hey, what's the status of legalization in New York? What are the interesting points that people want to learn about? What are the things that they don't know about that we can bring to the table? What are the resources that are lacking for our community? So every time we throw an event, we do a very long session. We send out surveys, we talk to people, we really learn what's happening. And as our market's rolling out, we're being a little bit more reactive. Previous events, we both Jacoby and I've been in the existing market. So the things that were happening in existing markets, we would bring into New York. But now that New York's rolling out, we're hearing from our community, we're hearing from New Yorkers what's of importance. So then we will create programming around that. And we're also create programming around things that we're interested in as well as we're exploring. Maybe we want to do a license, maybe we want to do a brand. So we're bringing these things to the table for programming. And then this is what's kind of unique about us. We never do a call for speakers like most trade shows or events do. They'll like send out an email blast to have speakers come to them. What we do is we figure out who would be really amazing speakers for that topic within our network. So anybody on our stage is usually a first degree or a first degree's first degree. And that's how we've been able to really keep it tight and really keep it authentic to like what we believe in and what our ethos is as an organization.
Yeah, I had your partner on, Jacoby, and when he explained that particular model, when it comes to seeking speakers, I thought that was so ingenious, and that was such a great idea, because you're right. I mean, for the most part, it's either people that are just like paid a lot of money because they just go everywhere and they say the
Yeah.
same thing, or it's someone you've never heard about, right? But like in this case, like first degree, I mean, that's how LinkedIn works, right? The degree of who you're connected with by first, second, or even third. And that matters. I mean, when it comes to like, do I know this person? Well, who mutually do I know, right? Who do I have in common within my network? And then you can kind of do some research. So you
And that's
usually,
also
yeah.
that's also how legacy works. You know what I mean? Like you work with people or who you're introduced to, and that's it. Like you're never going out and like, hey, so blah, like it's never like that. So I think,
You would be broke if you answered every single spam email, right? Like, or LinkedIn email that you get, like, hey, I can help you with sales, or do you need help
yeah,
with HR?
yeah, exactly. So I think that just kind of sets us apart in terms of really creating something that's authentic to us, right? Like, secondly, we limit everybody to 10 minutes. So, we call them our signature talks, but they're based on TED Talks because we know the New York patience level, right? It's like no one's going to sit still for 20 minutes to hear someone talk about blah blah blah. So, and it's also a nice challenge to the speaker, like who's been doing, maybe talks
Right.
over
You
and
gotta
over
get it. You
again.
gotta get it out.
Make
You
it
gotta,
concise, like
yeah.
keep our attention. Like it's been a nice challenge also to give that back to the speaker. So when they come on our stage and present, it's like really on point. It's like concise, it's entertaining, it's educational or inspirational. And I think that's a level that it's New York. We want to bring that to the table.
Right. Yeah, and I mean the experience that you're talking about, it seems, I mean it's in person, right? So I would imagine a lot of the content can then be evergreen and used online, or
100%.
is that gated, or is that free content? Like how does that
It's
model
free.
work?
Like
Okay.
right now it's completely free. one of the things that's really important to us at On The Revel is not gatekeeping information. I was very fortunate when I entered into the legal space in 2015 that I had friends from college that welcomed me into their operations and, let me just learn as they learned. And there's not a lot, and back then there was not a lot of information out there. And but I did see, how limited resources were to people that wanted to try to come into the industry or information or just access in general. So one thing that was really important for us at On The Revel is as New York came online, we never wanted to gatekeep anything. We never wanted to prevent people from not having access. We're also at the type that's like, we're not trying to convince you to join the industry. We're not trying to force you to do anything. But what's important is like, we want to bring good information, the right information, and good people together. So if you decide to, you're armed with really with resources that can help you navigate on however you want to partake.
See, that's what I love about that also is even if you don't want to be in the industry or even if you don't want to consume, I mean, I think there is a level of importance for just disseminating information at a basic level so that people have that basic understanding of why this isn't bad. And, you know, of course there can be adverse effects. It's an external substance, but what I mean is that it's this what we've been taught all these years and what we've been told, right? Like none of that is true, right? So destigmatizing and removing that understanding that we were lied to basically is important. And I think that would be another thing because I've said this before. We live in a very ally driven society now, and if people understood the value and the good that cannabis brings, right? When it comes to, you think about hemp and all of its endless applications, you think about cannabis for its medicinal use and properties, and then even the environmental benefits. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, 100 years of prohibition and 50 years of like messaging from the war on drugs, like it's going to take a little bit to
Right.
kind of unpack and unravel that and reprogram that. I'd say maybe deprogram that and kind of rebrand what cannabis is. So, part of our initiative with On The Revel is, making sure that in New York, there's been a lot of communities that have been really kind of screwed over from the war on drugs, the Rockefeller laws, the stop and frisk. So we feel like we have an obligation to make sure that folks from, different backgrounds and different socioeconomic statuses and just different cultures are able to have this information. So, we've been expanding our events outside of Manhattan. We originally had everything in Manhattan because it was just an easy access point, right? Like everybody can flow into Manhattan. But starting as of last year, we went up to Yonkers, we're in Brooklyn. I just did an event up in the Bronx, so it's just really important to start helping with normalizing and destigmatizing, like you mentioned, in all communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you spoke about it earlier and how the psychedelic industry has really taken a fast track because they've really leaned on the medicinal, therapeutic, even pharmaceutical aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, is that too late for cannabis at this point with 19 states at adult use? I mean, and 36 medicinal, but like what are your thoughts on that? Did cannabis miss the boat in that aspect?
I think the main difference between cannabis and psychedelics and the contention that happens with cannabis is there is no race war that happened with
Yeah,
psychedelics, right?
right.
Like the negative connotation of psychedelics mainly has been around like LSD, right? It's
And the
like, oh,
counterculture, right? And which is
yeah,
not race driven. It was more of a movement.
the
Yeah.
counterculture was very much a movement with white people, white youth, so
Right, that's true.
all we heard was like Jimmy took 10 hits of acid and he went crazy, like there was no stop and frisk, there was no immigration related stuff. There was none of that around psychedelics. And, there's been very positive studies around psychedelics towards, uh, end of life, towards depression, towards addiction, towards a myriad of a lot of things. But there hasn't been any like stigma around it.
Right.
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 So a lot of people are coming to psychedelics because there's so much positive information out there. It's, from the news articles to the New York Times to
Right.
books to Netflix to all of that. It's like, it's almost like the favorited plant medicine because, it went to like John Hopkins University and graduated, like, so it's like the favorite like child right now when it comes to plant medicine,
What a
with
great
all
way
the
to put
alpha.
it.
So, and unfortunately, like, but that is also another interesting world because I feel like that world there's contention between like the scientists and the money, right, versus the healers and the indigenous aspect of where these plants came from.
It's a fine
So,
line we're about to cross. Yeah,
yeah, that's
totally.
going to be another interesting conversation and tension point for the legalization of that world.
Right. I mean, ideally, they could live and coexist in one world because
100%.
right? I mean, inevitably, the pharmaceutical industry is going to get their hands on it and they're going to do what they do. But it would be great to also have a shaman or, a spiritual
Mm-hmm.
healer that practices that plant medicine where you could go
Yeah.
to them, right? If you wanted a more native and indigenous experience.
Yeah, I would say like the term that's being used a lot in the legislation is therapist. And I think the definition of therapist needs to be kind of defined. A therapist, when I hear it, is a very Western, like, oh, went, got my medical degree and da 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 da, and like, um, versus, maybe a religious leader could also be a facilitator. Maybe the shaman that you're talking about can be a facilitator. There's definitely different types of healers involved from the holistic psychiatrist and therapist all the way down to a Reiki healer and a shaman, X, Y, and Z. So I think there's definitely a need for both. I am not in a camp of one or the other. I think, um, people respond to and need different types of healing from Eastern philosophy, like spiritual practice healing to Western medicine healing. People need both. And
Mm-hmm.
I do agree. I hope at some point the intersection of both can come together.
Yeah. I'm also just fascinated from a macro view of like the societal impact that psychedelics and cannabis have had, both like when they've been prevalent and then when they haven't been, right? So I always think to like and we touched on it, the counterculture in the 1960s, late 1960s, and like what I think it was it 1970 when the Controlled Substances Act was passed. So basically putting psychedelics and cannabis all in Schedule 1, right? So I'm bringing this up because I think over time, when that gauntlet was put down, like you saw a change in music, right? I mean, think
All
about
the
the
time.
1980s and that decade of music and
Mm-hmm.
how it sounded so different than the 60s or like even the 70s, right? And so,
I I really
yeah,
believe that quote unquote drugs, right? That's what was considered back then, and it is by many other people. I think it has a huge impact on culture and music,
for
100%.
sure, a hundred
A
percent,
hundred
yeah.
percent. Ketamine entered the dance floor space probably like 15 years ago. And you can definitely tell a change when, ecstasy was predominant dance floor choice to
Right.
ketamine. Like it became it's completely different. So I think my friend got his master's at SVU, and I think he mentioned that there was a foremost expert, actually, professor that talks about how drugs basically initiate culture and fashion change. And I thought that was fascinating. We
I
should probably,
believe it. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean it there is definitely something to that. And even the interest of the culture in that decade, right? And just the way people went about their the way they presented themselves. And I wonder with so how much animosity is in the air like currently, right? When it comes either to politics or beliefs or this or that and the other, it's very polarizing on both sides. And I wonder with more access to these plant medicines, it's not that I wonder, in fact I know, it would be a world of more thought in terms of how you're treating others or how you're carrying yourself, more self-awareness, less ego, right?
yeah,
um I
more
think that there'd be more
consciousness.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, more consciousness. I mean, I think when anytime I hear people talk about like, oh, I want to on a journey or on a trip, or I've been smoking more cannabis or consuming more plant medicines, like there's definitely one common theme is just connectedness.
Mm-hmm.
Connectedness with yourself and who your true self is, connectedness with the world, the planet, others. So I do really believe like 100% that it's definitely something that taps into maybe like your humanness
Mm-hmm.
that might be closed off for certain reasons, but it just definitely untaps that.
Yeah. And you hear those stories. I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, being in tech, for so long, especially in the development space. And that's like, you know, microdosing, right? I've heard that's a
Yeah.
common theme. Like,
Mhm.
tell me about that world, because I mean, I know of it from personal experience, of course, not as regularly as maybe some technologists do, but like, what are the benefits? Like, what's that all about?
So I think so what's been interesting is, I started working with Oakland High like right before COVID. So it's been like 3 years now, but just being able to interview people that were microdosing, being introduced to other healing groups and talking to their members or even doctors of different types. Like I said, there's so many different types of healers. And microdosing is very interesting because the way I describe microdosing versus a full trip is kind of like the full trip's like an exclamation point, like sentence exclamation point. You experience it. Microdosing is more like a paragraph or a vignette, like it takes a little bit longer to get there, but I think the destination of what you get to can be very similar. It's just one with microdosing, you're incorporating into kind of your everyday life, and it's kind of like a slow hangout versus the macro dose or the journey, the trip dose. You're kind of just like you jump into the ends of deep end of the pool, and then you're in a different dimension, and those lessons and those conversations with yourself just happen so much quicker and just in your face, slapping you in the face sometimes. So
Right. Well, and there's an element of like productivity though, also,
oh
right?
yeah, yeah, 100%. So what's been really interesting is, a lot of people that I've talked to come to microdosing from psilocybin because, and they're, it's like, oh, it's natural. I feel comfortable. There's been so many studies, and LSD, poor LSD still has like this really big stigma. But I always say, what's really amazing about LSD is that it's always consistent. It's a formula. It's a compound
Right.
with mushrooms, like as its whole fruit form, it's still an organic thing, right? So like just like with any vineyard of wine, every year is different because of weather, soil quality, X, Y, and Z. So, and the other example I give is like when you eat a strawberry, not every strawberry tastes the same. One might be sweeter, so there's variation that comes with mushrooms, like if you're using the whole fruit body, but LSD is like very consistent. And I would say the difference between the two is I have a healer in Mexico, Gray Wolf, who kind of described it very interestingly to me. He's like, okay, think of like all the things that are organic. Those are kind of the ancient shamanism, right? It's things to help you go into yourself, to ground, to, learn about how you fit within the ecosystem, like your piece of how you fit into the world. And then he's like, but humans being humans, we were given this ability for technology. So he's like, think of all of the new types of psychedelics like LSD and even ketamine. That's going outward. You're going outward and connecting with like the universe, the multiverse, the ether, the 3D, whatever you want to call it. And I would say that's very true from the feedback that I've heard as well as experienced myself. The mushrooms are more of like, another way to describe it is like yin energy, more kind of internal. And the LSD is definitely yang energy, where it's kind of outward. So in terms of productivity, I'd say 100% of people report that the LSD microdosing is like definitely activating, definitely energy. Had many people. It's one other thing that's been really interesting. Sorry, I'm
No,
talking more
keep
about
going.
kind of
You're
like the
good.
feedback
Yeah.
that I've talked to with people. So I'm in my 40s. So my generation was prescribed SSRIs left and right. I remember like when I was in tech, so I went through the tech bubble burst in 2000, and it was the first time I got laid off. I got my pink slip. I was like really upset, and I went to see my doctor for my physical, and the first thing they did was write me a prescription for Zoloft. And I was like, what is this? And when I took it for 2 weeks. I was like, this feels so weird. Like my tongue felt so big. I felt like I was salivating, and just energetically, I felt like I was coming down from MDMA. I felt like I was just like in a really funky place. And that was the point where I was like, this is not for me. And I was also realizing like it's okay to be upset, like physically this didn't match with me, but I just got laid off. Like I should have feelings. It's okay.
Right.
So
It's like masking, natural human emotion and behavior where it's good to have those emotions if you can, I'm not even going to say control, but understand like why you're feeling that way, right? And just kind of come to terms with it and let it out. A lot of people bottle those emotions in, and then one day it just explodes and erupts, right? Because they
100%.
haven't shared, they haven't talked to somebody about how they're feeling, and vocalize that. I get it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we as a culture are not taught to deal with, maybe I'll call them the shadows of our humanity, right? So we're taught to like, oh, just be happy, or don't worry, like just be happy, like, oh, you're angry, you're upset, like walk it off, brush it off. And these are parts of us that just need to be recognized. And if we don't recognize them when they appear, they are just like little children that have been neglected, and they're just gonna be in your face nagging at you until like you recognize them and give them some attention. So so back to what I was saying was like my generation SSRIs, my partner, he's in his 30s, and his generation grew up with Adderall and
Adderall
Ritalin.
and Ritalin. Yep.
Mhm. So I would say, like, again, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a scientific researcher. I'm just sharing like anecdotal stories and feedback. But it seems like the SSRI kind of vibe is more associated with the microdosing for the mushrooms, the psilocybin, and the more like Adderall stimulating type of energy and effects is more related to the LSD. So I've heard a lot of people using LSD to taper off of like Adderall, Ritalin, caffeine, like pre-workout supplements. So it's been really interesting to just learn also how many people are on pharmaceuticals for like a very long time, 20, 30
Oh
years.
yeah, it's insane. If we could do a percentage in the United States of adults, let's say in their 20 mid 20s to 50 years old.
Oof, I would. So I don't know if my segment is skewed because I talk to a lot of people from healing world, but I would probably say at least 75% of everyone I talk
I was
to.
gonna say 80% of the
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was very surprising to me because I was, when I first started interviewing people, I was thinking, oh, this is like self-development, like, self-expansion, and it is. Healing is all part of that. But I thought it would be more like you said, like, oh, these are the developers that are using LSD to like do the code and fly through it and build their apps and stuff. And it just turns out that there's a lot of people who are tired of taking, medication that, one, doesn't really help their scenario, but two, has brought on additional side effects that just um aren't making them feel right anymore. And after like 20 or 30 years of feeling kind of like nothing's helping, people are just very excited to see that there's maybe other opportunities that are coming that have been proven to be more beneficial.
Yeah. I mean, that statement is exactly Beryl Solomon's story. She was recently on my podcast. She's the founder of Poplar. And she,
Mm-hmm.
like, Ivy League grad, like, never even thought about touching cannabis, even in college or anything, she said. And then she was pregnant, and her doctor, she basically asked about her being on SSRIs and, like, being pregnant and all that.
Yeah.
And she looked up, she didn't really get a good answer, so she looked up online, and cannabis kept getting brought up, I think, as like um something to get off, not to take while she was pregnant, but like an alternative medication in replacement of the SSRI after the pregnancy. So the pregnancy brought the discussion up, and then once she tried cannabis, she was like, oh, okay, like, I get it, like, and then from there she's like an operator now. So it's true. I mean, and it's just interesting how each of these chemicals and these external substances affect humans differently, right? Like, there's no one
100%.
size fits all. Like, you
100%.
talked about how some people that are more prone to taking Adderall and caffeine maybe lean to LSD as another alternative, if those options aren't working for them. And then on
Yeah.
the other side with psilocybin, right? And the SSRIs and tapering off that way. It's fascinating. Like, what has been your experience with, the plant, with cannabis? I didn't really talk to you about
Oh
that. And
yeah,
like
I
even psychedelics.
yeah, my experience is kind of different than most, I'd say. So again, I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. It's like hippie utopia. And when I was curious about cannabis, I was 13. So I mentioned it to my aunt, and my aunt went and procured the best that she could find and
It's a
proceeded to
cool
sit.
ant.
Yeah, she sat with me and proceeded to give me 8 bong hits because she's like, sometimes you don't feel it. So really want you to feel it. I felt it. And then I remember just like, gosh, I just remember the whole wave of like it hitting me from my head down to my feet. And I remember just like the dimensions changing,
Yeah.
and at the end she took me to IHOP, and
So it was like a real psychedelic experience.
for me the weed it's sometimes very psychedelic for me.
Yeah.
And then when I was interested about psychedelics, my uncle, when I was 15, procured for me and sat with me for my first mushroom trip. So I've had a very protected and safe like experience. Like most people I talked to was like, I was in college and we took all whatever we could, and like it was cool at first, but then like after 10 hours with LSD, I didn't know what to do with myself. So
Right.
um
Right.
it was a really great experience, and I was able to take kind of those learnings from my experience. And sometimes I've been called like the Sherpa, for my friends that are in colleagues and family members that are wanting to experience plant medicine. And yeah, I love microdosing. Like I've got so many projects going on, and people are like, how are you managing that? And I have to say, like, it, I'd say that the psychedelics in the past 3 years, because I stopped smoking. This is how ridiculous my brain is. When COVID came, I was like, okay, if anything happens and the zombies come, I need to be completely like on point. So I realized that was also the first time I've been smoking cannabis since I was 13. I was like,
No
okay,
breaks, like you
no
just kind
breaks,
of always, yeah.
really no breaks. And I was like, okay, maybe it's time to just take a break. And just, if the zombies come, I want to be like clear headed. And then I was like, okay, well, I like the way that the psychedelics feel, the microdosing, because I started making capsules for friends like maybe like 7 years ago for end of life.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like go forward with this. And it was just really cool during COVID being able to have that experience. And what it taught me was psychedelics, microdosing especially, really helped my intuitive voice become the strongest voice. And
Hmm.
I started making decisions around that. The chatter of other things, like whether it's been inherited from culture or just even with my DNA, X, Y, and Z, society, those voices started becoming less and less like disruptive.
So
So
faster decision making
100% faster decision making, really understanding energy and vibes, right? Like really being able to
and not
tap into
questioning it and being like,
and
I
not
see it.
questioning it.
Yeah,
Exactly. Like is definitely a confidence booster.
for
And
sure.
now like 3 years into this of kind of being on the regular, I'm like, I don't do it all the time. I'm more now of a situational um microdoser. There are kind of tools that I have at my disposal that I need to help, with things.
Right, right.
Um, but I feel like my life is just a lot more in focus and
It's
moving
great.
in flow towards the things that I want, right? Like first and foremost, it was helpful to define what I wanted. Like I knew what I didn't want, but
Yeah,
definitely helped with finding what I wanted. And it definitely helped with trust, trusting in my decision making, trusting in my colleagues. But that was also my responsibility to decide what situations I wanted to be in and who I wanted to work with.
right, right.
So now I kind of have this rule that's been super amazing is post COVID, anyone that I'm going to actually spend time with, I need to be able to put as an emergency contact.
I like that. Yeah.
And that litmus has completely changed just the
Because it
energy.
closes the circle, right? I mean, you see all those posts, and I don't mean to demean them because they do make a lot of sense, but you see them so often now with all these like motivational influencers. But it's like, really protect your circle and like keep your circle small. And that is so true though, because the more noise and people that really don't add value to your life, like whether they're holding you back in certain ways or they're just negative all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
like, I mean, that manifests that shit, you carry that with you
Yeah,
know?
and it's like I want to be around the builders right now, the
Right.
doers. Like New York Cannabis is coming out and a lot of people aren't happy with it. Like there's some things that don't work, but my whole thing right now is like instead of spending the energy and talking to people about why it sucks, let's try to take that time and work around solutions, right?
Right.
Like we can't change anything
Yeah, it's out of your
really.
control.
Yeah, but you can choose to how you want to spend your time. So, I found out like, hey, New York cannabis has been drafted to be very much similar to Washington regulations. Cool. That's the state that I came up in. So I'm making calls to everybody that I know in Washington state so I can interview them and learn about like what's been helpful, what's not been helpful. And if anybody wants to like learn with me, come along.
Right.
So that like I think that is definitely 100% change in how um I deal with things that don't work right for me,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
another thing is sometimes, I travel a lot and, just frustrating sometimes when flights are delayed or things don't happen. And before I'd get so upset, I'd work so hard, be on the phone trying to like change my flight. And now I'm like, well, maybe if things are so difficult, maybe it's more of like kind of like a shift, right? Like it's
To
not really
pivot.
a blockade,
Yeah.
It's more like a guide, like, hey, if you get on that plane, maybe something stupid would happen, right? So
Right. Or
it,
like, are you gonna take the time to get so upset to like call the front desk and try to change your flight and go through that like all that internal emotion and stress when you could just be like, well, I'll wait to the next flight.
yeah, I'll
You know what
take
I
like
mean?
that
Like,
hour and work on this brief that
right,
I have to do, you know? So
right.
um it's just helped with flow. You know, I just feel like things are more, I'm making decisions that I have the North Star, and I'm making decisions to navigate everything towards that goal. So that's what's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound like you're relying on anything. You're using them as tools, like you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when they're needed. So that's great. I mean, that's clarity, that's focus. That's I can relate in certain ways. In this part of my life right now, I feel like I have that great flow as well. And I think that COVID taught us a lot about that, right? Of like,
I hope so.
bad habits and like what we can change. And as you're talking and how you talk about these tools that you're using now with plant medicine, I think about like my past, like, and even others currently, right? Like if you're just, and I'm not saying alcohol is bad if you want to do it, right? Or drink, but I'm saying if you're constantly drunk and waking up hungover, like that's a
Yeah.
whole different path that you're on where there's not that clarity, there's not that focus. I mean, other hardcore drugs, cocaine. I mean, like it's just hard to manage and sustain, with those types of external substances.
Yeah, I'm 47. Like this is it's like it's
You don't look
definitely
47. That's insane.
thanks.
I when you said you're in your 40s, I was like, wait, what? Because I definitely thought you were like at least in your 30s, low
Oh, thanks,
30s.
Kevin.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm 47, and I can definitely tell you my body is just, it takes longer to recover. That's why I don't, for me, I love deep journeys like trip dosing. Like I will probably do once every quarter, of the year, every, I do it when I'm called to it. It's not like a religious, like I'm coming to this point where like, hey, if my body wants something, if my spirit wants something, that's when I do it.
Right.
And it's not a habit. It's just like I'll feel a calling for it, and I trust that something in me is calling. I feel like everybody, you're your best teacher, you're your best doctor, right?
Yep.
You just have to be open to listening to those signs and being aware of them.
Right.
I'm also going to say it has not been this being using psychedelics and incorporating like into your life sometimes is not the most comfortable. I there's this one strain that I used with this healing group called Mazatepec. I cried for 4 months straight, every single day, cried for
Whoa.
4 months straight. That strain I think is just very beautiful and very powerful. It's one of the strains that Maria Sabina introduced to the West. It's an indigenous Mexican strain, but I feel like that is a really great strain if you're trying to deal with inherited things, right? Like inherited trauma that your parents had. Like I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents lived in China during the whole Cultural Revolution and the Civil War. Um, Things that you might learn from society that you never really, as a woman, that you
Right.
never really had the choice for your self choice, but it was just part of how you grew up. So I cried for 4 months straight. My poor partner. But it was really interesting because it really helped my ability to relate to my parents, because
Right.
we came to the States, they had no idea what Western culture was. I grew up.
And you're basically socialized in this new culture now, right?
Exactly.
Leaving a complete like family and a heritage behind in the East. I mean, that's yeah, that would be very beneficial to see that.
And then
And
I had one healer. So I work with a group called Minka in Brooklyn. They're fucking amazing. Aki and Manu. They're amazing human beings, and they always said like when you're doing work on yourself, energetically, you're like it transfers to before you, like to the
mhm,
generations before you, but it also helps with your DNA, like your daughter cells, as you stop inheriting some of that too. So I feel like it was very true. Like it really, my parents had a reaction when I talked to them that was like so unexpected. So um, I think that at the end of the day, cannabis for me is a really amazing medicine for
Mhm.
my physical ailments, for, sleep, for aches and pains, for my menstrual cycle, like it's been very helpful for that. But I think the psychedelics have just been very helpful for my spirit, for my focus, my clarity, my mental health, my emotional health. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how I describe how it works for me.
It's a good place to be in where, you can find something that really does help your day-to-day and overall, well-being in life. And it's something that that you can use when you need it, right? It's not something that you're just taking every day behaviorally because, you were told to do so 20 years ago, right? Or whatever it is. So that's what more people I think are understanding and seeing, and it's just beautiful that these stories are coming to light more and more, Lulu. And really appreciate you sharing, your story with us today, and what you guys are doing with On The Revel, which is important work, right? It's educating, it's bringing people together, and it's talking about this burgeoning industry that's really helping change people's lives.
Yeah, so if you guys are in New York, I'd welcome you. We're having our next event on February 25th in Brooklyn. It's a Saturday. Jacoby's agreed to start segmenting some of our programming toward psychedelics. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, good call, Jacoby.
And we're really, really stoked. We definitely welcome anybody that wants to, come and learn and meet good people. And this it's our playpen, so come play with us. Like, intention and integrity, we always welcome.
Love that. Love that. Where can people find more information about that February event or just to learn about On The Revel more?
Yeah, so our website, ontherevel.com. And then of course our Instagram is at on the revel. And we'll be releasing more information about our events. But just subscribe to our newsletter. We start sending out programming and speakers. We'll probably do that pretty soon, starting in the new year.
Nice. Lulu, I really enjoyed talking with you. You're super
Yeah, you
easy
too.
and you have a lot of knowledge, when it comes to this stuff, especially experiential knowledge, which is super important. So, love to have you back on soon in the near future and just talk about,
Yeah, thank
how
you.
things have evolved.
Yeah, and then if anybody's in DC this weekend, I'll be speaking, hosting a panel and talking about LSD microdosing at the National Psychedelic Conference in DC.
Nice. You're all over. You said you travel a lot. I can see that you're doing that. So keep up the great work. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's been my pleasure, and it's been great chopping it up with you.
Absolutely. Yes. And thank you all for listening. Bye.
Bye.